If you know a decent amount about climate change, you have likely heard of carbon capture before. If not, carbon capture and storage, or CCS, is the process of removing CO2 from the atmosphere and keeping it stored somewhere safe, hence reducing the total concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere and reducing the greenhouse effect. There is a wide and often furious discussion within the climate science community about whether or not carbon capture is a viable and beneficial technology, or whether it is a dangerously uncertain alternative to simply reducing emissions. During my time trying to answer this rather complicated question for myself, I came across an educational example of why so many people are skeptical of a technology that is likely to become extremely important 50 years from now. Carbon Engineering is a CCS startup initially funded by key climate philanthropists like Bill Gates, who has been extremely enthusiastic about carbon capture since the technology first became mainstream. Say what you want about the man and what he represents, but he clearly believes that some unprofitable institutions need to exist, and is happy to be their bankroller. And that unprofitability term is very important. The recent uptick in development of renewable energy sources in countries like the UK is largely driven by their kilowatt-hour energy generation being cheaper than natural gas alternatives. No matter where you fall on the political compass, climate technology which is profitable is always going to be more widely accepted. This has always been a barrier to the development of carbon capture, and environmentalists are well aware of this. Hence, they are largely not convinced such an expensive and unprofitable technology should be invested in when renewable energy sources are both cheap and profitable. This brings me to Carbon Engineering, a BC-based former startup that has recently been bought by Occidental Petroleum for $1.1 billion US. So why did Oxy buy Carbon Engineering, a company which seems to be working in the opposite direction to them? The answer should be pretty obvious, and it comes from this net zero idea that has become so prevalent in the way we tend to talk about the climate crisis. Carbon Engineering have net zero written all over their website and any press release they have ever given, which is strange, as carbon capture is one of the only technologies that can accurately claim to be carbon negative. So why this downgrade? Why not go that step further and do what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, and most environmentalists want you to do, and be carbon negative? I think the reason is quite simple. Carbon Engineering is more interested in being a profitable and viable enterprise, and therefore making a few people very wealthy, than it is in contributing to solving the climate crisis. There are economic arguments for and against this approach. However, when it comes to carbon capture, the real problem comes from how you become an economically viable enterprise. Before Carbon Engineering's lucrative purchase by Oxy, they were developing what they called a clean fuel, a petroleum alternative made from carbon dioxide that was sucked out of the atmosphere, making it net zero. Except it doesn't. This is the slightly mathsy part, so pay attention. Carbon is stored in the ground as oil, gas, and coal. This carbon is burnt to generate energy, and hence carbon dioxide is released into the atmosphere. Carbon Engineering have a big carbon vacuum in Squamish, which, as a gross simplification, separates the carbon dioxide from the rest of the air. This carbon dioxide is then transported to their processing plant, which makes their carbon-neutral fuel. This fuel is then burnt to generate energy, and so the same amount of carbon dioxide ends up in the atmosphere than was originally there. The way I've drawn this makes it look like net zero is an accurate description. But the process of capturing carbon and the processing of the captured carbon to make the fuel takes energy. Carbon Engineering uses BC's grid, which is supplied by a mix of renewables and natural gas almost always, and so will involve some burning of CO2. Never mind however many emissions were required to construct the plant in the first place, the process of making this carbon-neutral fuel burns more carbon dioxide than is extracted from the atmosphere. The whole thing is so circular that it's been hard for investors to catch on that this technology is literally not carbon neutral. It's carbon positive. It is extracting CO2 from the atmosphere so that consumers can use it at great expense whilst thinking they are lowering the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. But ultimately, to get this fuel into their car or into their generator, they have had to use more carbon dioxide than was initially in the atmosphere. They have made the rate of climate change worse. This makes Carbon Engineering deceiving around their own technology, and hence the fuel is now described as ultra-low carbon rather than net zero, which will be very important in any court cases they may face later. This grifting behavior is not the only example of its kind, and it makes a lot of sense that Carbon Engineering would sell to Oxy for such a lucrative deal. I want to see carbon sequestration grow. I know not everyone may agree with me on that point, but I think that carbon sequestration is important in the future for reducing the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere when we curb our emissions, and the IPCC agree with that perspective. It's a necessary part of reducing the impact of climate change as much as possible. But companies like Harman Engineering are making it harder and harder for that to happen, because continuously the government and the general public are deceived by what CCS is being used for.